The tyranny of Zoom is over. Welcome back to Teatime Talks in person. This is the first one since 2020, and it's a really big deal for everyone in 14 Henrietta Street to have people back inside this building. Over the course of the pandemic, we had people like Mick O'Dea from across the street, art historian Cathy Milligan, historians in spades and others. But I think, museums are all about engagement. This is a living museum, and to have people back in it is so important. And like many things in my life, I owe my appreciation of the poetry of Paula Meehan to my late friend, Tommy Smith, who was a great champion of Irish poetry and who supported not only poets, but poetry as an institution. I remember one day Tommy introduced me to the poem, The Statue of the Virgin at Granard Speaks, and that began a great journey for me. And he brought me on some great poetic journeys, Hartnett, Kinsella, and beyond. Self-described Dublin bulgy woman. Isn't that a great description? Paula Meehan is a poet who writes much about place, much about memory, two themes that are very strong in this absolutely gorgeous book. And I mean, the poetry of Paula, the photography of Dragana, and also the great work of Una Young, the designer who put this together. It's a stunningly beautiful book, and we are so, so proud of it. I'd like to start, Paula, I suppose. I heard you speak recently at a book launch, Terry Fagan, Monto Terry, down under the bridge at Cleary's. And you gave a sense of your own background that day. So it seems nice, I suppose, if we start with your sense of place in the inner city.
Yeah, I was at Terry's launch. It's only about a month ago, and he asked me to say a few words. And I met Terry in 1983. It's very vivid. I met him walking down Summerhill beside the NCCAP, the community action project there that was really like an office for Tony Gregory in those years of fighting for housing in the inner city. And we were involved in a trilogy of plays on the history of the inner city. It was directed by Peter Sheridan and was based on research in the area. And this was 1983, and I had just come back from America, and Terry came up to me and he says, "I have great information on your great-grandmother." And I was saying, "Oh, yeah, gosh. The dealer." And he looked at me, he says, "Do you know what she was dealing in?" I said, "Yeah, second-hand furniture," and he laughed. And he showed me some of the stuff he had. And that began a kind of a journey into my own family history, the suppressed version. And the way some families talk about the skeletons in the closet. Well, we have whole warehouses of skeletons, and the more I dug, the worse this troop of characters came climbing out of the archives, and one more scurrilous and deranged than the next. And so I started to take that information back to the living members of my family, the aunts and uncles. And from them, that had gone totally, that information that my great-grandmother was one of the main madams in Monto with 7 brothels on the go, that had all gone completely underground. Now, there were little hints and intimations along the way, and putting it back together, I was able to fill in some of the story, but it wasn't until Katrina Crowe, our great archivist, put the 1911 census up online, the 1901 and the 1911 census online, that I began to actually engage with the written record of the family history. And the family history reflected an area of the city that was a lens on colony. The barracks in Aldeborough House in the revolutionary era, the soldiers, the sailors coming in from the docks. I mean, it was a fantastic, thriving economy. And we refer to my great-grandmother in the family now as the entrepreneur. But that is not to minimize the trauma of that area, because that is really what the generations subsequently have had to unpick and deal with severely traumatized community, not just with the decline of the area as an economic ecology, as Louise Lowe calls it, but with the subsequent oppression under a theocracy, because you can imagine how that went down, the trades in that area from the rise of the Catholic Church through the 30s, and right into histories of neglect and deprivation, right into the heroin epidemic of the 80s, which was on a collision course. Now, I see people in the audience, old pals from both the inner city and from Finglas, where I also misspent a good bit of my youth, and they can join in and contradict me at any stage. But anyway, when the 1911 census went up online, I was really able, with one caveat, that in that area nobody spoke truth to power. Sure, why would they? I mean, who's going to tell the truth in 1911 on a census? It was Lower Tyrone Street then, the street of the brothels. But by 1914, it was Railway Street, which was one of a number of iterations by the city corporation at the time and later the council to erase memory. So it wasn't just the growing theocracy that was going to wipe out the memory, and the natives, if you like, the native inhabitants' ways of eluding capture and pinning themselves down, but also it was the corporation, and even to renaming Mabbott Street James Joyce Street. One of the things which was renamed first, it was renamed Corporation Street, and we have the great oral historian of the buildings here with us. My good friend Mick Foran and Kay Foran beside him, and these are the real oral historians of that whole area. One of the lovely loops, and then I'll shut up, one of the lovely loops in the making of this book was that it was designed by Una Young, who's a book designer, an artist, a gallerist, as they say. She has a gallery and her studio on Mabbott Street, exactly where my grandfather was born, where my great-grandmother made her early life as a young mother and an entrepreneur. When I found her birth cert, I found out that she was married at 13 to a much older guy, Charles Meehan. Her name was Anna Plunkett, and she was born in Purdon Street, another notorious street in the area. She was married at 13. She had her first child 7 months later, so I can only assume that she was probably carrying my great-uncle Jack at the altar in Marlborough Street. So the subsequent to that meeting with Terry Fallon has been my attempt to put these pieces together. Now, I'm not a historian, so that kind of information often just confuses me. I'm a maker of poems which are like songs, so my lyric is always threatened by information, trying to cram it in, when all I want to do is just make it up,
You mentioned the great Katrina Crowe, and not only did she get the 1901 and the 1911 census online, they're free to access, which is absolutely incredible.
And she had to get a special act, and I think it's called an instrument of government or something, to get it up early in 2007, so it would be there for the historians to literally, the Dublin census of 1911, there for the historians to remember, literally remember the communities and what was going on and where the people were living, the actors in the revolution. So Katrina's work and the work of the people that I love from my old community in the inner city, they inform whatever information is reliable in this book. The rest is all arm chancing of the highest order.
We talked about this earlier, about how the academic historians, sometimes they take a dim view of oral history, but do they believe everything that's in a state report? I think there's often the real truths are in those oral histories, the work of people like the North Inner City Folklore Project, Terry Fagan. That brings you to the heart of folk memory.
Yeah, you live, I certainly as a poet, I've been living in the chasm between the written record and what you can put together through all the different sources, especially as they come online. But in the folk memory, which is the story hoard of that community, which is actually full of nuggets if you can mine it. Like I remember my grandfather told me that I took after my great-grandmother, his mother, Anna. Her nose was always stuck in a book, he said, right? Now, on all the official documents that she signed, she puts an X. So how do I read that? Was she an illiterate poor gobshite, you know, down in the rapidly deteriorating tenement as the teens went into the 20s, into the 30s, and that whole street fell to dereliction? Or was she a learned woman who read a lot but wasn't going to let on to anyone because of her business what kind of information she was, you know, even her name? I've never seen her name written, which I would love to, you know. So I feel very, very close to her. I feel appalled by some of the stories that reach me of the kind of life that was lived. But I feel very close to her, and I do feel her pressure to get at some kind of truth, even if it only satisfies me.
In terms of time, it's interesting that this house was a tenement, believe it or not, into the 1970s, a very exciting time in Irish life. Dermot Fairder always says the 1970s are Ireland's 1960s. You know, things that happened earlier in the world finally happened here. You were in Trinity in the 70s.
So they say.
So they say, yeah. And you say an interesting thing was the number of Northern students in Trinity, the friendships I made that have lasted to this day. I don't remember us ever asking each other what religion we were. It was all about the music you listened to. The 70s in Dublin was a battle for the heart and soul of the city. Do you remember all that around streets like this and the future of streets like this and preservation?
Yeah. Well, in '68 there was the Dublin Housing Action marches, and it was like, you know, the places I was living in as a student were all kips, you know, rooms like this, but certainly not in green, tasteful distemper paint. I lived on Mountjoy Square then, and the place was falling apart, but I suppose we learned our independence there. You know, you learn to live on nothing. You know, I mean, where do students go now? They stay at home with their ma and dad. At least there was. I mean, I know they're kips and they're awful, but you'd stay in these tumbling down Victorian rooms, or you'd stay in old Georgian rooms, and you might have just one tap. But you know, you were learning independence, which is all really that's important that when you're young and fit.
What is the process of a book like this for a poet to collaborate with a photographer? Who was responding to whose work, and how did this come into being a reality?
Right. Charles Duggan, who was the heritage officer at the time, was kind of project managing this book, and he would have introduced me to Valerie Connors, who's a curator of photography, contemporary photography. And she introduced me to amazing photographers. Like, she brought me books of photographs, all living and all available to the work. I had already written the poems. They were just a bunch of manuscript. In fact, I found the notebook I was using, Keep Calm and Sail Away. And it was May 1917, because I have the versions here. So they were typed up, and then I looked at lots and lots of photographs, and what brought me to Dragana Jurišić is her name, Dragana Jurišić. She had grown up in former Yugoslavia, and she'd made extraordinary photographs of going through Yugoslavia just after it was abolished. So she kind of was born and raised in an abolished country, really. And she told me this story of origin. The day her house burnt down during the last bit of Balkan bother, her house was burning, and she was standing outside with her father, who was a photographer, and he took one last photograph of the house where his entire archive was in there. He took one last photograph of the house and handed her the camera. So she had done work on the muses as well, and because this is a museum, which was originally a word in Greek where you put things that please the muses, and it was built out of that kind of classical iconography of the Georgians, who were just, that was their thing, you know, to grandeur, they would have all done the big tour of Italy, and they were influenced by the Renaissance, and they wanted this grandeur. You even see a little up there, you can even see the lyre that Orpheus played. So it's all about those classical motifs. And so museum, it was a place to put things that pleased the muses. And the muses were originally these really wild mountain goddesses. There was nothing discreet and mannered about them, as you see in the Georgian architecture. They were wild mountain goddesses. So I thought I could work with that. And Dragana had done a book of photographs of women, hundreds, about 100, I think, women, and naked. And she asked them, of all ages and sizes, and she asked them to identify with a muse. So I would have seen those photographs, beautiful photographs of humanity, female humanity. So I thought, yeah, this is the one. And when she came, I brought her around to show her things and kind of talked to her. And I didn't even realize she was taking photographs. I thought she was fiddling with her machine, which was an old-fashioned box camera. You know, and she was like this, walking around. And she'd occasionally look at some of the things that she was photographing. I had no idea she was photographing me, raving at her as I'm raving at you now with great enthusiasm about everything. So it was lovely, and the fact that the designer of the book, who used like the blue, Reckitt's blue, any of you who grew up in the tenements in my era, will the red rattle and the Reckitt's blue, which was used in the wash, and seemingly these materials have antibacterial properties. So that was also kind of a cleanliness thing, you know, to paint the walls with the red rattle and to use the Reckitt's blue in your laundry to whiten. So all that labour, and the fact that she was living on the stretch of the street where my family, where my grandfather, who taught me to read and write, where he was born, where his mother, the entrepreneur, and her partner, let's say, where they had their babies, you know. So all of that went into it with great heart from everyone involved, put a lot of heart into it.
One of the things about it, you were saying that it was written, well, it was published in 2019. Yeah. So the pandemic was just around the corner, and it never got an airing in the same way a collection of poetry normally would. Well. So you're saying you haven't read a lot of these poems in public?
No. And maybe they're not meant as great public things, you know. They're very kind of, they're very worked. And they might be for a quiet place where you take this as a memento of what you've seen. That's what I had in mind, that it would be something you could take away from here and all the different experiences here, and maybe in a quiet moment find things in it, you know. That was my plan. And I loved that she used the floorboards and the walls. I loved the things she used to frame the poems. So I didn't mind. I actually trust so completely in poetry that I didn't mind that it wasn't going around. That I minded, of course, that I was being kept under house arrest.
You're talking about how reading poetry on Zoom is not quite the same.
Oh no, it's like wearing a corset. You know, you're plugged in, or you're trying to manage sound, and it's completely anti-poetry, actually. I think the people who made the most successful use of Zoom, and I see Colm down at the wall there, you made fantastic use of Zoom both with your students and with getting stuff out to the community. But I think the use of film came into its own. So instead of just seeing a face speaking at you, the poets or their curators made small films that the poems then were like a soundtrack to the film, but it didn't even necessarily have to explain the poem. So I thought that was a lovely development out of that house arrest. But tying yourself to a machine and trying to speak at a bunch of little tiles as a poetry reading, forget it.
You touched on the first poem in this collection quite a bit there, Invocation. There's a lot in it about place, there's a lot in it about memory, and I was hoping that would be maybe the first poem you would read for us today.
Place to start, yeah. I wanted to explain in this first poem in a way what I was doing and about the Greek connection, you know, where the word comes from. So, and traditionally in the English tradition, and remembering that this is also a place of colony, I wanted to reference the traditional invocation to the muses that the poet would use, you know. So, invocation. As old houses harbour ghosts, so do words. Take museum, which comes down from the Greek, a place to put things that please the muses, a shrine or seat of the old goddesses. What you find here might not be what you seek, rich, poor, citizen, commoner, lady, lord, mortal trace made immortal by design. Surrender as you enter through their door. Know all are equal here in time's brute trust. We are held, the quick, the dead, the blessed, the cursed. Open heart and mind to those who've gone before, to honor the muses, virgin, mother, crone, and hope to glimpse them ninefold in this house, daughters of memory, oracles of grace.
Yeah, I think when people walk through this house, they're drawn to different things, you know, historians, architects, photographers. Dragana actually, at the end, she talked about what drew her in. She said the DNA footprint of the people who lived in the house is impressed into the floors, stored beneath the floorboards, carved onto those walls. It's the walls that fascinated me the most. They were like secret maps inviting you to imagine the hundreds of destinies 14 Henrietta Street witnessed. And you seemed, what I get reading the poems, especially drawn to imagined sound. You talk a lot about the sound of children playing, the sound of mothers, the mother's cries, the child's first birth, later references to Angela's bells ring out the moon. You really seem to have imagined the soundscape of this house.
Yeah, the acoustic is amazing, isn't it? And I suppose, although this was like a public commission for this house, a lot of the material comes out of my own childhood growing up in the tenements, and the acoustic of the flat we lived in eventually, because we lived all over the city, and homelessness was a constant kind of fraught shadow in our home. My parents were back and forth to England for work in the 50s, and I was often with my grandparents, which was an absolute blessing. But the acoustic of the flat we lived in, one window, the windows looked out into Gardner Street, and Luke Gardner was the man who developed everything we see on this street, the whole north fabric of the Georgian city, the north side, was really, Luke Gardner is in there everywhere. So our windows in our flat looked out on Gardner Street, but the front door was on Sean McDermott Street, which was named for, you know, the patriot who gave his life for our freedom. And I was kind of coming conscious of these things in 1966 with the commemoration of the 1916 Rising, 50 years. So as school children, I mean, I was 11 then. Okay, you were in Central Model School as well. I mean, there was a lot of, you know, all around my hat I wear the tricoloured ribbon and the Clive Sullis, and Jesus, I couldn't wait to grow up and die for Ireland, you know. Absolutely. You know, I'm going out there, give me my Clive Sullis, I have the songs, you know, the Foggy Dew, and there was the ballad singing, and of course the uncles were all mad into the ballads, and there would be drink and ballad singing and the whole 9 yards. So the acoustic is the thing, you know, that what you're hearing, well that's, I mean, isn't that the poet's job, what you're hearing? And the songs, of course, and of course the stories, and the recitations. And you know that, Mick Foran, from, you know, you have that ear for those fantastic rhymes that, you know, we would be stood up on the table, especially in my grandmother's house, and you'd be, you'd have to have something to give, you know. You had to have a song or something, or you were, you know, there was no way you weren't allowed. There was no way you were allowed get off that table without entertaining.
You talked about 66 as a very formative thing. It always reminds me of Ding Dong Denny O'Reilly, a parody folk singer, and he had that song, "The Crack We Had the Day We Died for Ireland." You know? But it strikes me that the centenary, and you were a great contributing voice in that decade of centenaries, that there was focus on things like the role of women in 1966 was just not spoken of at all. The people in tenements didn't feature in the 66 commemorations. It seemed very, very narrow compared to now.
Well, except that we were, you know, in the tenements, and we were in Miss Shannon's class, and she had us, you know, drilled on the, you know, word perfect in the poems and the songs and the whole revolutionary spirit, you know, which when you look back on it, the earnestness of it, and of course, you know, with time you realise you're only getting a bit of the story, you know, but at the same time, Markievicz was huge. And years later, I was looking at a little exhibition in the National Gallery of the Countess's things, you know, and she sent out this, what reminded me of the photographs sent out by, you know, rock bands or at the show bands. She had herself in her uniform with her gun, you know, there, and the hat, and she'd signed, and she's sending that about, and I began to think about, now this is much later, but I began to think about how we were all in some way victims, but also, you know, there were lovely things involved, pageants and dressing up, victims of whatever propaganda was being fed through the curriculum to us, you know, including a very narrow view. Obviously the winners write the history, but to paraphrase Frank Hart's great statement, the winners might write the history, but the losers, the people, write the songs, you know, especially the songs of the poor and the labour songs, the songs from the docks, workers' songs. And there was a whole, as Frank Hart in his archive emphasised, there was a whole, like flies in amber, there was a whole archive of women's lives, working lives, in the song tradition.
Markiewicz's comrade in arms, Margaret Skinner, was a school teacher across the street. Someone came in once, a former pupil, and said to us, she was meant to teach us prayers. There was a certain time in the day where she was meant to teach us prayers, but she'd close the curtains and teach us rebel songs instead. On the subject of sound and song and everything else, the second poem in this collection, there's a lot of sounds in it, of natal charts and end games.
Okay, blast that. This one, I should say, is, I was thinking about the nature of fate, how, you know, your life, how you connect with things and people over the course of your life. So I was trying to look at Dublin, well, I was looking at it on maps, different maps through the years, and I started getting interested in the water supply, which one of the things about this street is that it had one of the first reliable water supplies at that time in the Georgian era. But also going back to Mabbott Street, where the book was made and where my grandfather was born, it was called Mabbott Street after a man who set up a water wheel there to get water to that little district in the 1700s. That's where it got its name, Mabbott, Mr. Mabbott. But here it was the Vartry water. They brought it in from Wicklow, and I think it was your man Gray. There's a statue of him on O'Connell Street. So the Vartry water was piped in here, which was super kind of fancy in the day. So I imagine them drinking the bedrock of Wicklow in the water at the end. Okay, of natal charts and end games. Not the clock to measure time and tide, but the moon, her waxings, her wanings, her track across the star-spangled heavens, trining and sextiling planets, to net and land another whole incarnate soul, to earth this karma in the shelter of the house. Cellular mirrors celestial, the spinning globe slows to rest with the mother's cries, the child's first breath. While elsewhere in the house, a different room, a death, a last glimpse of ceiling as the light fails lobe by lobe. Upstairs, someone dreams of walnuts, a new blouse, someone makes coddle, snuffs a candle, humps coal, sips Vartry water, tastes trace of phyllite, quartzite, greywacke, shale, slate, bedrock lithographies from far off Wicklow, while Angelus bells ring out the noon. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. And each of these poems was dedicated to one of the 9 muses, who are known as the daughters of memory. So each poem, I was trying to get at the kind of memory that each of the muses would hold. So that's to Urania, the muse of astronomy. So probably astrology as well, because I am into the wiggy woo a bit, you know, the natal chart.
John Gray would be delighted with that, and the Vartry water scheme also got a mention in Ulysses, so he's been well remembered in literature, if not anywhere else. Isn't it mad that the man who saved more lives in the history of Dublin than probably anyone?
Clean water.
Yeah, and no one notices his statue there. It's just so weird. One of your poems has become an integral part of the tour of the house, which I think is great. I never really recall being in a museum before and seeing them utilise poetry on the building in that kind of way, projected onto the bed in the room next door. Do you think poetry and arts more broadly underutilised in these kind of settings? Why not walk into a museum and be exposed to poetry?
I wouldn't say anymore that it's underutilised. In fact, I think it's actually moved in wholeheartedly. And in the decade of centenaries, there was huge number of poems commissioned, poems for choirs. There was a massive choir work written by Paul Muldoon up in the, you know, the old Collins Barracks, where the soldiers, in the big square where the soldiers would have been on drill, like, you know, thousands of voices. So I think poetry and all the arts have a place in memory keeping, which is the museum's job, and more I think the museum wants to bring, you know, different angles in. Of course, the curators are the gatekeepers, and they're the people really with the power, really, about what gets shown and what gets arranged and how it's shown. So there are, of course, always powers and elements of, you know, struggle within museum culture. But I think there was a reckoning, and you know this, Donal, that the arts could do something around memory, especially traumatic memory, which the 100th anniversary was going to have to bring up, you know. But that the arts would have some kind of a role in that, you know.
I see, like, a new productions, like site-specific theatre.
Yeah, exactly. And Ainu here, and you know, and even down to people dressing up in what they consider, you know, the garb of the time. There was and local projects all over the country, not just here, but there were also initiatives. Like, I'm very interested in the argument against, you know, because I think that's where you know, there's a lot of interest there in the resistance to the official version. So I think this 100th anniversary was completely different from the 50th anniversary, you know. There was a kind of a line being put out, but there was also the reality of the absolute crisis in the country, you know, that, you know, there was there was commemoration, but there was also challenge to the commemoration. You know, the Vartry water was, you know, not too far away from all the struggle in the communities over privatising water. So, you know, you saw the two sides, the two sides of the coin again, but in a very different way. So I suppose it interests me of how much artists will be co-opted to official versions, or how much artists whose role really is not to be co-opted, is to actually question and probe and pull at the thing and look for, hoping the truth will shake out. Because as I said, finding the written versions and the official versions in traumatised communities is only a bit of the story, and the real important stories are held in human transmission.
I thought we had a nice head start on the rest of the country with 2013, with the centenary of the lockout, and it was the North Inner City Folklore Project. It was all the community groups that kind of hit the ground running, and it did kind of feel like there were 2 decades of centenaries. There was the state commemorations and there was the community response to events.
Exactly. And it was the community, I believe, response was largely fueled by grandparents and great-grandparents and old uncles and, you know, the old people in the communities who could say, no, actually it wasn't like that. Like you gave me a brilliant image, Kay, when I was asking you, because you are in some ways a more reliable memory than mine. I was asking you about the flu, the 1918, the so-called Spanish flu. And, you know, because I don't remember that coming down in many stories. I mean, there's a lot of stuff about TB, and I've written about these diseases in the typhoid. A girl that sat beside me in the Central Model School died in 1963 of diphtheria. Claire Reid. Yeah. You know, so I mean, those diseases were racketing around. But you said that you had someone had told you about bodies being carried out of corporation buildings on doors. No.
Who said that? I don't know who said that. It wasn't me.
No. Okay.
It might have been Terry said it.
Right. That because of there weren't coffins.
Yeah.
That they were carried out on doors. I suppose. Sorry. Excuse me. I'm going into the gruesome details.
Yes, but even before that, people didn't have money to bury people. And my brother died and he was sent up, my father brought him up in the coffin. So you're 7, he hadn't made his career, so you hadn't reached the age of reason, 7-year-old. So the church didn't really respect that, I think.
Yeah.
So I said to my father, I don't remember being at the funeral. I dared say that to him years after because we didn't speak of my brother was drowned. I said, I don't remember being at Tony's funeral, and I just saw my mum and dad's face. And my dad said, oh no, we weren't that. And I said, I must be minding the kids or something. And then my mum said, yeah, we actually didn't have a funeral yet. Mr. McGarry brought the coffin up to the graveyard.
Yeah.
I thought, geez, that's not 100 years ago.
No.
That's not 200 years ago. So that was sort of fairly common around the area, that children, they died young, they were sort of, it was like if you have a dead baby, they weren't recognised or taken, you know, and they weren't 7 years of age, they weren't classed as
the age of reason.
They hadn't been made a communion and all that. So lots of that, yeah. So.
Well, there was a limb all the time.
Yeah, all the heavenly things and all that. Yeah, but so a lot of stories would have been about people that died that hadn't got graves, and it's still very raw what a lot of people, you hear them saying, oh, they got a pauper's grave. There's no such thing as a pauper's grave. It's a grave, you're in the grave.
Yeah.
But people say, oh, well, the pauper's grave. No, so it's inbred in them from years and years, all that kind of stuff that was said about the dead, and church not having respect for them, not having money to bury their dead, you know, so that kind of stuff.
Maybe the pauper's grave is the one that isn't marked, is it?
Huh?
It's not marked.
Yeah. The name is lost.
Yeah.
Our brother's grave wasn't marked.
Huh?
Tony's grave was never marked.
never
Yeah.
marked.
He was put into the angels'
Yeah.
block.
Yeah,
When my father died in 2012, his mother and father were buried in Glasnevin, and there was only his mother's name on a small little curbstone.
Yeah.
There wasn't a headstone that we could add my father's name to. So I remember I contacted Glasnevin Cemetery, and I also was interested because my father had a sister, Maud, who died as a baby, and I was interested to see was she buried in
In
that
the
same
same grave.
grave, and we would add her
Name.
to a new headstone, you see. And the lady on the telephone said to me, no, she's not there, but there are 3 other people in that grave who aren't related to you.
Yeah.
And I said, well, how do you know they're not related to me? She said, well, that they were buried at particular times, and the families were given 12 or 15 years or something to grave.
Yeah.
And when they didn't pay for them, it was then sold to somebody else.
Yeah.
Or
The space.
some other family was given the opportunity to bury their dead there.
Yeah.
So I felt she wasn't telling me the full story. I rang back the next day, and the lady said, no, there are 6 people there buried ahead of your family, and they're not related to you.
Right.
So there was a child actually buried in 1918, but there was also men in 1895 and 1870, and all sorts of different dates. But those names are lost because they're not on a gravestone.
Yes.
But they're not lost because they're still recorded in the Glasnevin cemetery.
What's really fascinating about Glasnevin, I remember my great-grandfather's in one of those paupers' graves. He's at the Somme Gallipoli Passchendaele in Arras, and he's buried in the pauper's grave in Glasnevin. And Shane McAmosh, the late historian, brought me there, and he said, this is typical. There's more people in this cemetery without a headstone than with one. And when you look over Glasnevin Cemetery, to think there's more people without one than with one is extraordinary. Death is sometimes called the great leveller. In the next poem, you call Bert the leveller, which pays no heed to class. The poem that people hear in the room next door on the tour of the house. What's so interesting about that poem is it's kind of about the more affluent beginnings of the house, the Georgian time. Was that harder to connect with, maybe to relate to, given your personal history that we've discussed, getting into the heads of the Georgians?
Well, I don't know that I got into their heads, but I think the house has these layers of history, and I didn't want to ignore that, because I think the spaces do. They're about how your body is in the space, and it was the bed that sparked this. That was one of that bed next door was bought by Nicholas Moss. Isn't his name Nicholas? I think his first name. Dr. Moss, who founded the Rotunda Hospital right down the road on what was Rutland Square, Parnell Square. And he got this bed made in beautiful mahogany for his daughter-in-law. So when I saw the bed, it was the bed connected to stories from my childhood of women who would, for choice, go to the Rotunda. Now, this is a folk story. There may be no truth in it, but because it was perceived as a Protestant hospital, working class women felt that you were more likely to stand an equal chance with the baby if something went wrong. That poor kid, I'm just thinking of the tenor of these conversations. But anyway, that could have been folklore. It was certainly, my mother believed it, even to the point that some of her friends on the south side, because my mother grew up in the Mount Street tenements across the river, another foreign territory altogether. But some of her friends would register with us to have their babies in the Rotunda because they felt it was safer than going to the National Maternity Hospital, which was totally part of the theocracy, really, things that weren't even, again, very difficult to speak about these things. These things go very far underground. And to actually have the conversations, especially as the generation moves on, that generation who lived and worked and in the 30s and the 40s in this city, in the working class communities, in these houses you see out the back, the Sims houses. My uncle Wally, who's in his 90s and still is like sharp as a tack, he remembers sitting on the granite step of the house in Lower Tyrone Street, also known as Railway Street, looking over at Liberty House, which had just been built. So it's the 30s, and it's one of Sim's houses. And Sim's travelled all over Europe. He went to Vienna, Amsterdam, Zurich, and he brought home photographs. And they're interesting because many of them have the Nazi flag hanging in them, in some of them. But he looked at inner city housing for families, and he saw that courtyard. You saw your children, you hung out your wash, you had a pram shed. He saw the balconies to see your children. And the great disgrace in my lifetime was the way those brilliant housing units were just let, in many cases, go to rack and ruin. We're very late realising the value of them. But my uncle remembers sitting on, and the women talking about what flat they wanted, because one of them wanted the flat above I think there was an eagle on one of them. And she wanted that flat. So he remembers that, mostly the voices of the women he can remember. So that was a huge shift from the tenements over into this new social housing, which, you know, is a model of its kind. And I think that we have totally betrayed the vision of that early architect in a time of great poverty in the city, was able to make houses for the people coming out of the tenements.
He was speaking at a housing inquiry in the 30s, and he had a great line. He said, you cannot rehouse 15,000 people, as we've done in Crumlin, unless you provide for the other necessities of life. Yeah. He felt that everything had to be there. It wasn't just a place to live, it was about community. We kind of lost that.
Well, it's just, we all know what's out there, you know, the crisis. There's no use rehearsing it again and again and again. The dogs on the street know what's going on out there, you know, a lack of political will. You know, I think of myself as a direct, what would I call myself, you know, that I benefited from political will when O'Malley made secondary education free. You know, Donal O'Malley. I mean, I consider myself one of his children. That free education was there and allowed just that chink of opening for people to get a secondary education, you know. But that was, he was the minister, and he went and he said, we will have secondary education and we will have it free for ordinary people. I don't see that kind of will in action at the moment, you know.
So that poem which people hear as they look out the window at Henrietta House from Herbert Simms, this bed, this raft on stormy seas. It's a great moment on the tour because people don't expect it. People are drawn to the detail, the Georgian detail, the stairs, and then there's suddenly a poem projected onto a bed. It's kind of the last thing you expect when you take a tour of a house like this.
And I realised I totally went off on one, didn't I?
Yeah. Well, that can happen with Herbert Simms. It's that kind of subject. Always unfortunately relevant. But yeah, the moment when this poem plays and people's eyes are drawn to the bed, it's amazing. The way the building is used throughout the tour is a kind of canvas itself. But that's a really, really, really special moment, I think. So may we hear it?
Okay, yeah.
A blast of it, like the uilleann pipes.
Okay, this bed, this raft. This is for the muse of tragedy, actually, even though it is about, you know, I mean, I saw, you know, the old poem Death the Leveller. It is an old poem. I think it's John Shirley, Death the Leveller. Sceptre and crown must tumble down, and in the dust be equal made with poor crooked scythe and spade. And it was an early kind of socialist poem. They didn't tell us that when they were teaching it in school, though. I think birth also, that journey into the world, to come in, to survive the journey, it just seems to me entirely miraculous in every generation, in every class. But I got fascinated and a bit waylaid by the beauty regimes of the women of the Georgian era. Like they were big on eyebrows, and we have seen recently a revival in eyebrow culture. But they would, and here's a few tips for anyone who wants to keep going in that direction. They would skin mice. They wouldn't do it personally. They'd have a mouse. They'd have a mouse skinner who would skin the mice and cut out eyebrows, which they would stick on to their where their insufficient eyebrows would have been. And moles, they were big on beauty spots, and they were often taffeta or a bit of silk. But there was a whole trade in that. There was a trade in false teeth. Like people would sell their teeth and sell the teeth out of the corpses to make teeth. People would, they'd cover themselves in mercury to get the white look. White was the thing, right? They'd cover themselves in mercury. And these are now obviously the ascendancy classes. People from my class would have been selling their teeth. But they couldn't sit too near the fire because the heat of the fire would burn the mercury and they'd get all these lesions on their, and then of course they'd have to put more of that stuff on. So I got really sidetracked by a book called The Art of Beauty, which had all the recipes for this stuff and how to make black lead, because to brush up your eyelashes, and seriously toxic. You know, if you didn't die from sitting in front of the fire with your servants running after you, tragic. Okay, so anyway, this bed, this raft on stormy seas. The start of our lying in was the end of mornings at the pier glass, mouse skin eyebrows, eyes outlined in jet, cheeks rouged, got from recipes in The Art of Beauty, gallnuts, black lead, mercury, carmine, liquid pitch, her glued on beauty spots of taffeta and silk, her drapery, her napery, her blue, blue walls. Birth the leveller pays no heed to class, to kind, our crossing fraught with peril to body and to mind. In every generation there are stars that fall, a lost galaxy of nurture with our mother's milk. A miracle we make it here without a hitch. This buzzing hive of life, this golden bounty, honey of survival in our ancestors' sweat, salt tears for those who don't survive the quickening. That was the bed.
And I really liked the tangent we went off on there, because I remember seeing it one day projected onto the bed, and then outside in Henrietta House and the Sims buildings, you know, children running around playing. It was a really lovely moment.
And they do have lovely footage because of the connection to the rotunda. They have lovely footage of, is it the 60s, the 50s, of different, anyway, of the nurseries in the maternity hospitals, you know, because they were very regimented in those days, and I think the children were taken immediately into the nurseries.
I know at the minute, we were talking about the decadencentenaries and all that, you're currently engaged in a really big project around Joyce and Ulysses. And it's sometimes said that the working class city, the tenement reality, that's the kind of great missing feature of that great journey through Dublin, the 16th of June 1904, beyond my town, where they ended up. It'd be nice to hear how that's going, this project engaging with Joyce.
Well, it is going, and I have to actually stand up my hind legs and present the work in August. But what happened was I got this, you know, and of course the lure of a few bob. Well, I have to say that it was quite Joycean, you know. So, and it's a big project. I'm only one small part of it, but 18 artists were asked to respond, one each to a different episode in the great book. And I got to respond to Heydays, which is the underworld, the land of the dead. Lovely, you know, lovely. Bring your hankies, it's going to be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Lamentations, elegies, mourning, I got that, great. And it's in the book, it's Leopold Bloom is on his way to a funeral from Sandymount. He gets in a carriage with a few dubs, and there's all the Dublin kind of banter and little digs at his otherness, his Jewishness, and his wife, who's, you know, obviously a well-known character. So there's all these little sly digs going on, but they're on their way to a funeral in Glasnevin, Prospect Cemetery. And but what's going on in Bloom's mind on the journey is the suicide of his father, the death of his son, whether Molly is, you know, in her flighty mode, and his young daughter who's taken up an apprenticeship to a photographer in Mullingar. And he's worried if he just walked in on her, what would she be up to? She's 15. So he's wondering, what is his young daughter? What's she doing up there? Could he go up and visit her? Mightn't be good. He might discover too much about her because she's coming to the age of, she's a young, in his eyes, she's on the brink of womanhood. So these are the things that he's worrying about, anxious about on the way to the funeral. Well, all the Dublin kind of, digs and cracks are going on. So it gave me a lot of leeway about what I would work with. So in a way, I mean, it fed into, and the poems all came in one long rush. And the book will be dedicated to Kay, because again, Kay, I check with you a lot of my memory, because I think a lot of my memory is imagination. They say that the part of the brain that remembers is also the part of the brain that imagines. So when you're working in places that have erasure, I suppose is the contemporary word, or where memory, because of trauma, has gone underground or has disappeared even, that you do have to imagine what the story is. So the part where the very same muscles that remember also imagine. So of course I took that as absolute freedom to make it all up again, to make it all up again. So I've had a great time with those poems, and I wrote 27 poems. It's a small collection. As I say, it's dedicated to Kay because there are things that from our childhood that I can't talk to with anybody else, and I get very emotional. I often get very emotional, okay, don't I?
Yeah, both of us do.
Yeah. And I know that, you share these, you know that there are people who share particular kinds of memories. And to me now, that's really, those people are so valuable as time goes on. It is also, I think, a function of getting older, that if you don't have people as sounding boards for your own memories, you could start believing the official version, and then you're lost.
You talked about the theocracy and the role of religion in our lives. Whenever Nora Barnacle wanted James Joyce to stop drinking, she'd say, "If you don't stop drinking, Jim, I'm going to baptise those children." Yeah. And he stopped quick enough. From Homer's Odyssey and Ulysses to of Odysseys and Other Rambles, my favourite poem in this collection, I think it's a bit of Joyce in it, I think, maybe. Hentown bladder clucked from threshold to attic room. I love the language in this poem, and it's also the one that mentions the stairs. And there's something about the stairs in this building. People are really drawn to them. They're a particularly evocative place.
Yeah, they were the back stairs, so they would have been the servants' stairs back in the day. And then, they took out the original stairs. Those of you who've done the tour of the building will know they took out the formal entry stairs to make another room, another tenement room, and squash in a family, the agent. But the back stairs where the servants would have gone up and down, and then later, of course, the people who lived in the tenement, when it was a tenement, would have used those stairs. There are things in this house and in Georgian houses generally that I feel in my body, body memory, more than any kind of an intellectual memory. I remember, because I've an old pal from Finglas. We moved out to Finglas from the flat in Sean McDermott Street, and we exchanged with the O'Neills, who moved back into town. They couldn't stand it out there. They were from the Cumberland Street flats.
My brother,
Yeah, exactly.
My brother invited Joyce and Paula's mother transferred.
We did an exchange, yeah. And so I moved out to Finglas, and one of my old neighbours from Finglas is there. And I remember moving into the house in Finglas, and I couldn't stick it. The ceilings, everything felt really like miniaturized. And in fact, you could have fit the whole house into a couple of rooms here. So I'm not advocating squalor as a mode of living, but those big rooms did have their own charged air. There was something. And to go then into the house in Finglas, which of course I grew to love, but that first going in, thinking, gosh, this is tiny, but it was the scale of the rooms.
Kathleen Meehan claimed that when they went out to Crumlin, she thought someone else lived upstairs. That downstairs was their home and upstairs was someone else.
Adjustment. There's a lovely Ryark documentary, I don't know if you've seen it, Eddie. Yeah, isn't that amazing, of the first people into that new estate in Finglas. And you can nearly smell you could when we moved in, smell the wet concrete, you know, the damp concrete. So that comes with its own freight. I better read your poem. We better let people go home. So this is your favourite poem, okay. It's of Odysseys and Other Rambles. Okay. So just by way of this is for Calliope, the muse of epic poetry, because those stories could, from something happening in the morning, by the time the sun went down, the story would have gone through mouth to ear around the whole tenement building or around the street, and it would gather drama with every mouth to ear. So something that would start out as quite a small thing could become like epic. So of Odysseys and Other Rambles, yap, raw mate and rigmarole, if these walls could speak, Hentown blather clucked from threshold to attic room, fabrications, downright lies, home truths and lullabies, stories snagged from time, spun into the yarn of the house, the ghostly racket of the carriers of tales who lug their water buckets up and down the stairs, all gossip, all frittery bustle, their epic. If musing on an ornamental frieze of oak, an iridescent bird through a canopy of air, let's drop a feather to your hand, then use it as a quill to enumerate such fates, damned or auspicious, the senses of this shelter might immortalize such vestige of lives endured through crash, through boom, flitting like some magpie, stolen trinket in her beak. So there is an ornamental frieze of oak out in the stairway. You know, if you look up, there's beautiful frieze, and the magpie was associated with that particular muse for some reason with epic poetry. So the magpie got in there somehow.
It's such an evocative place, an emotive place on the tour, the stairwells, because it's the communal space, you know. It's the shared space of the home. You ended this collection as you began it, with questions around memory, museums, and what they mean. And you and Dragana both kind of talk about the house at the end. You said something really beautiful in that conclusion. You said, a museum is a dead space unless it speaks to the now. Do you think it's important that museums are as much about the contemporary society they exist in as they are remembering a past?
I think they're always about what's going on now, you know. By looking into the past, you're framing how you got to be in the world now. You know, whether you go over to the museum and look at the longboats the Vikings came in, or look at the amazing golden ornaments. I mean, when I saw them as a kid, I thought, wow, I could see princesses and the robes. You know, they're always a way of using the past as a lens on your own life. You know, I think museums where they just put things in cases, they can be fantastic and they leave it totally to your imagination. But I think museums now are very active about framing things and trying to bring people in. And you know, there's people arriving on this island who don't have our collective, if I can even use they don't have our collective past. They don't have our kind of referencing, our sounding boards, our history. They're arriving in with who knows what trauma or life experience or joyous, you know, it doesn't have to be all people arriving in bits. You know, people come with hopes and expectations, economic migrants. So they arrive in, and I think the museums could have a role in making our past on the island, making it more, I won't say accessible, but giving it a space for things to happen, for their own memories to measure against our memories. I mean, I'm speaking as someone born and reared here and probably drowning in my own history, you know? So I think their role is really to address the present.
So guys, I just want to say in conclusion, Paula is a poet beloved of our national institutions, the state, including the president himself, Michael D. Higgins. But I think what's probably most important is the people of Dublin love her work. And I think she's a great poet of the urban, of the suburban, of the working class experience, of the story of women in Dublin, and so many other things. And it's a great matter of pride for 14 Henrietta Street to have published that beautiful collection. So thank you all for coming, and thanks so much to Paula for reading these poems, many of which were read for the first time in public here today. That was a great thing. So Garbina Malgo, we'll be back next month with another Teatime Talks with Frank MacDonald on planning in Dublin.